I think we are going to have certain industries and certain types of workers that you do have back in the office a lot more. I don't think that that's going to be so New York, San Francisco specific. I think that those industries that you see spending so much time in the office in New York, finance, insurance, capital, whatever those things are. Yes, they're going to continue down that path, and that may sprawl a little bit. But I think you're going to see those same types of companies in other parts of the nation do the same thing.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by FlexIndex, the leading global insight platform for flexible work. FlexIndex covers flexible work strategies for more than 13,000 companies across 100,000 office locations and 120 million people. Today, my guest is Nathan Manuel. Nathan is the co-founder of PM2 Consulting, which does representation and project management for real estate owners. Nathan previously ran real estate and workplace for PagerDuty and MediaMath. In this episode, Nathan discusses how he approached office development and innovation over a 10-year stint at MediaMath, including the build-out of 22 offices. He talks about innovation in office post-pandemic, along with which office models may be better fits for different types of companies. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast.
This episode of Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Office Benchmarks. In today's hybrid world, workplace executives face critical lease and space allocation decisions. Make the wrong move and it could cost millions, impact productivity, and hurt retention. You need reliable data, not news headlines. That's why companies like TD Bank, Southwest, and Chime rely on Office Benchmarks. Office Benchmarks is the only solution that combines flexible work policy and office usage metrics to help workplace leaders compare their footprint, space design, and usage to peers with similar policies. Get started today at flexindex.com.
Nathan, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Nathan, I was looking forward to this because you've done a bunch of really interesting stuff and have gotten into the workplace space kind of in an interesting way. And so I want to start a little bit with your background. Tell us a little bit about how you got into workplace in the first place.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely came through some side doors. When I went to school for business, and that led to me moving to Washington, D.C., and I supported nonprofits as a consultant. And what I found was really small nonprofit organizations, they move a lot because they really can't afford any rent increase. So if your rent goes up $1 per square foot, they're suddenly moving. And so there was this cycle for over about 4 years where I helped almost 50 different nonprofit organizations in Washington, D.C. move from one office to another. And that was my first time looking at blueprints, understanding how real estate worked at all, going on sites and doing tours, like real estate tours with clients before you sign a lease, going through this whole thing. But what happened is much like the kind of like 10,000 hours concept or the Beatles, working in Liverpool, it was this idea, like I was really grinding. We were doing a lot of these really small moves. And when you're doing that, right, you're just kind of in it. You learn more and more and more about every different organization, what the different challenges they have are, what things are that are the same, and what the things are that are like totally unique to that specific organization or set of personalities. So I was doing that, and I was, kind of maneuvering that world and decided that I was going to go to school and get an MFA in sculpture. And so it seemed to everybody like a really left field move. And so, as you said, I've had a bunch of different kind of like things. But the reality is that I had wanted to go to art school when I was younger, but I took the really pragmatic choice of going to business school and not following passion. And so when I went to school for sculpture, and I spent a bunch of time then making furniture. And so I was really into thinking about furniture and the function of furniture. And so I spent almost 2 years of my life making furniture that I removed the function from. So I was trying to make chairs you couldn't sit in and tables that didn't support things. And I was just kind of going through this pretty conceptual, kind of heady approach to how you think about furniture. And right at the end of that, literally the April before I graduated from my MFA, somebody came to me from my previous life and said, hey, I have this small tech company. We're about 40, 45 people, and we need some help building our first office and supporting our team internally. Could you help us do that? And so I said, yes. I said, I want to do that. So I went and did that job, ended up being there for 10 years, opening up 22 offices across 7 countries. And that was really like a catapult into the workplace world in thinking about real estate facilities and how people actually within organizations use space.
Yeah, Nathan, I've spoken to a lot of people on the podcast and outside the podcast over the last, I guess, 18 months or so. A lot of folks with design background, et cetera. I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone who physically built their own furniture, and definitely not anyone who built their own furniture for the purpose of not being able to sit in it or use it in that fashion. So that is a first in my experience.
Clearly that took a professional turn at some point where I was like, oh, people actually want to be able to use the stuff that they buy. Got it. I guess I'll make a shift. But look, I'll say. You probably know Ryan Anderson and some people at the Miller Knoll team. One of my first kind of early professional experiences in New York was I went to the showroom and I took apart a desk in the showroom. And I had team members with me, and they were like, hey, we have the guy who designed this desk in this building. Let's go get him and have him come down. And we ended up like nerding out over the building of this desk for like a half an hour, to the point that everybody left. They were like, we're not interested in this anymore. We're going to go look at the other pretty furniture while you guys nerd out about how this desk was made.
That's awesome. And the company I think that you joined, that you spent 10 years at, you said I think it was MediaMath, right?
Yeah, that's right? MediaMath. It was an ad tech company. Yeah, I started there just under the 50th employee. By the time I left, there had been over 2,800 employees. Yeah, and we ended up opening up, just about 22 offices in 7 countries.
You saw a little growth over that time period.
A little bit of growth. There was a point actually where it was 100% growth for the 4th year in a row. So 100%, 100%, 100%, 100%. And at some point you're there and you're like, oh, we're now at like 900 people. Like, how did that happen all of a sudden? And it just happened so quickly. And the ad tech world was just in that moment where there was really explosive growth. And it's so much more like fun to be on the design and build side when you're just like, oh, we get to do all of these fun things, including going to a lot of different countries. But then also that included building 3 floors of the Four World Trade Center in downtown New York City. And so we were the first commercial tenant in Four World Trade Center. And it really creates these really interesting kind of dramatic creative opportunities, because all of a sudden you're like having to think about all of the different aspects of that. And then because I wasn't formally trained in some of these things, when I would assess like how a team works, I'd go to marketing and say like, what's the thing you hate most about the current office? And they would say, we don't have enough storage. And then I was like, how would you think about having storage literally running down the middle of your desks, and you can put packages and things together like right in your space? And like, we love that idea. And we were lucky enough that we were and empowered enough to be able to do that. And so we had all of these really fun experiences. I'll just add one other little anecdote there and say we were able to really democratize that decision-making around that as well. So individual teams and the company at whole got to make really big decisions, including, did we go to Four World Trade Center or did we go to 34th Street? Did we go and we do these kind of like specific breakdowns of how we build and design spaces that really fit how you work? Or do you really want to say like every corner space will be open to the entire company and no one will have kind of like a corner office? And so we democratized a bunch of different decision making about that. And that allowed for a lot of that conversation about how we thought about employee experience, or how we thought about this thing that we didn't know we have the language for, but today that we would call workplace experience. And I'll just say quickly, I think if you look at my title, it was like EVP of IT facilities and real estate, which is like not a real thing. But it's funny because what ended up happening in practice, right, is that you become a leader for all of the assets. Like if it's a computer or if it's a desk or if it's a piece of real estate, you're kind of like in charge or helping manage or devise strategy around all the different assets.
It's actually not super surprising in my mind, because startups often grow up around the talent that's available to them, and they take top talent and say, okay, well, let's figure out how to give more and more scope and opportunity, as the company grows. And so
yeah, absolutely.
I've seen lots of situations where all of a sudden executives got a collection of things that maybe you would never have put out the job description to run those 3 things together. Of course, exactly. But it just makes sense relative to the way the company evolved. So you left after 10 years, you said, right? And that was, when was it when you left MediaMath?
Yeah, December 31st of 2019. And I started I started my first consulting company January 2nd of 2020 and closed it on March 21st of 2020, a whopping 2 months and 3 weeks later.
Why? Was there anything meaningful happening in the world during that quarter that
No, I can't imagine. Nothing happened. I mean, look, the pandemic is a really impactful moment in how we think about workplace, because we all know the people kind of in the real estate, especially the commercial office real estate world. And moving forward, I'm really hesitant to use post-pandemic language, but I'm very comfortable in saying from the pandemic forward, everything changed, a lot of shifts, how we thought about it. And I will say there were concepts that I was kind of like on the desk, jumping up and down and waving my arms and saying like, hey, pay attention to this thing, this concept, how we engage with people in distributed teams, how we engage with people across time zones, how we create async communications that are meaningful to people. A lot of that stuff was things we were talking about. We were one of the first customers for Blue Jeans, the like pre-Zoom
Video
software.
conference back in the day. Yep.
And so there were those concepts were already out there floating around, right? But it wasn't getting any traction. And every executive we talked to about it, even within our own company, was like, we hear you that that's a possibility, but it's not one we're interested in like investing in. And so there really was this moment where that shifted. And it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic to allow us to make that leap. And then simultaneously, that moment also brought people into my life that changed how I think about the world almost instantaneously. I'll name Melissa Marsh at Plastark was somebody that did that. Andreas Hofbauer was one of the people that like in that moment did that. There were people who had really been in the weeds thinking about those employee experience or workplace experience ideas, distributed teams and technology and how we'd implement them. And I had been lucky to connect with those people a little bit. And all of a sudden there was a leap into that world at that point.
So I have to imagine it was a really interesting bookmarking or maybe kind of like end of a chapter, beginning of a chapter, right? In that you built MediaMath during the heyday of not only people being in the office and the experience of the office in terms of that's also in the backdrop of the Google and other companies investing in all of these different experiences and almost enabling people to, de facto live in the office in some ways in terms of the way. And it was also a period where the expectation at most technology companies was still that most people were in the office almost all the time. You left to start consulting, and then what did you do after? And I imagine that next thing was quite different in terms of the mandate or setup around it versus pre-pandemic, if you will.
Yeah. So I think through some of those relationships of the people that I was just talking about, I had some entree into large customers that were thinking about how to manage their distributed teams. And then through a series of personal events, I went from being on the East Coast to being in San Francisco, right in the middle of 2020. And so what happened was all of a sudden I'm in a world where the capacity and the will to continue working and maximizing the use of technology was there. And so I have to say, I was really hesitant to go out and start looking for a job when I had just left a company after 10 years and was starting my own thing. But what ended up happening was I ended up putting my resume up on LinkedIn. 3 days into that, someone from PagerDuty reached out to me and said, hey, we think you'd be a really good fit for this role we have. And I was like, what role could you possibly have right now that makes a lot of sense? And then little could I have known that PagerDuty was one of the most exciting groups of people in the HR realm thinking about how to effectively come up with solutions and think about distributed teams of anybody I could have come across. And I know now in hindsight, I went to a bunch of other tech companies and talked to big companies and small companies, and I've been on panels with all sorts of people. And the amount of resourcing and support that I was getting there, I could not have gotten at all of the so many of these other companies. And so we were definitely an outlier in that position. And they were saying, what are some of the things that you can think about doing to help us really bring people together in a meaningful way that's going to allow for a mix of these different things to work, especially in a company that had become so distributed so quickly. And so I'll just tell you like a couple of quick anecdotes about that experience at PagerDuty. They had gone from being about 20% remote to about 80% remote. So they flip-flopped their numbers.
This was in 2020 that it effectively.
Correct. Yeah. They had been about 20% remote before. And then in 2021, they were about 80% remote. So it was a direct flip flop of where they had been previously. And so when the kind of like mass distribution happened, they were like, okay, what do we start to do to think differently about how we approach those people? And they said to me, if we gave you some resourcing, what are some of the things you would do? And so we did a couple of different things, and I'll just give you a quick rundown of how we thought about both the real estate, but also really the organization, because I think that some of those things are maybe the most important. And so,
And Nathan, just before you go into like what you did, because one of the things I
yeah,
wanted to understand in context around it is what was the mentality at PagerDuty when you joined around real estate? Like, were they thinking about how do I want to motivate people back into the office given the high percentage of remote, or were they starting to think about this is now a second space relative to where most people are working primary? Like, I'm curious, even what the ethos was around it before you get into some of the things that you did with it.
sure. Yeah, so I would say, like so many small to medium-sized tech companies, their mindset was confused. They were still unsure. They were looking to see what the large companies were doing. They were looking to see what really small companies were doing and saying, like, okay, we're not as agile as they are. So I don't think I don't say it with like negative bias or negative judgment. I really think they were confused about how to proceed, and they were looking for somebody to help give them some guidance on that. And though they had some people in house that could provide certain aspects of that, it was hard if you're trying to run an HR team to also be an expert in real estate or an expert in how workplaces could be designed. And so they were really searching, and they were a little bit agnostic, but I mean it in the way that they were truly trying to search for a solution that fit their team, that fit their culture, and that would solve some of the cultural issues that they were kind of starting to experience because of the really fast shift to that level of distribution.
So you were empowered both to think about the actual point of view for the company broadly on this topic and how we think about space, and as a result, what are some of the actions or things you want to go do about it?
I was, and that's exactly, I guess, to the point about why it felt like, oh, we really, in hindsight, had a lot of power, had a lot of say, had a lot of influence on what the company's future was going to be. And so, look, there was the acceleration of the DEI movement within the organization. At the same time, there was a lot of moments and places where we were able to like partner and really think broadly about, okay, what does this thing mean? It was no longer we need to maximize butts and seats, and we need to minimize the cost per square foot. These kinds of pre-pandemic levers or measurements were no longer the keystone to success for this kind of organization, and surely isn't the way that it is today. And so, yeah, with that said, I'll tell you, like, some of the things that came out of that was when we thought about the physical real estate, we were empowered to completely redesign some of that space. And so they have a beautiful office in Soma in San Francisco, and that, as all offices were packed with desks and not enough conference rooms to the brim. And we ended up removing a couple hundred of desks from the space, leaving about 150 desks in that space. And moments after we completed that renovation, I had said something like, oh, we should have gone down to 15 desks, not 150 desks, because the space simply was being used more for training, for collaboration, for getting together in a room than it was for any kind of heads down work, right? And so it was like, oh, we should have been even more radical than we were, and we thought we were being...
But 150 would have been inconceivable,
inconceivable,
right? A couple of years before
inconceivable.
That, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And so, what can you do? And then so we also, we got some attention because we, in that moment, again, really, 2021 kind of era, we created these open air conference rooms where there were large conference tables with Zoom kits and the whole thing out in the middle of an open space. And there were all of these concerns about, like, well, aren't you going to create audio leak into other people's working areas or whatever? And I was like looking around and I was like, no, not really concerned about that. It's not a huge issue when, we have 10% of the office being filled up by people coming to do heads down work. I was like, we'll create a loud zone and we'll create a quiet zone. And if you want to go be in a quiet space, go over there. We can have plenty of space for somebody to have an open air, conference desk over here. And then I guess I'll just give one more example, because it was really a project that I was passionate about and was really lucky to kick off there, was this PagerDuty pop-up program. And I'll just say, like, the creativity or the idea of slicing the organization on geography was one that we were thinking about, but weren't sure how to address it. So what we were able to do is we were able to look at maps heat maps of where employees were. And we were able to say, hey, where there are 30 to 50 employees, like, why don't we fly a few people from the ops team to those places and host a day or a day and a half long series of workshops, a volunteer event, a dinner, bring some executives, and have these moments where we're no longer slicing by, organizational unit like team or vertical. We're really saying like, oh, you just happen to live in this geography. Let's come and be part of your community and show that we want to support the things that you're interested in your community and do something fun in your community and bring some, not only dollars, but like real interest and investment into those places. And so we ended up doing 30 of those in 3 years. And I have to say, that includes cities, in Australia and Portugal and all over. It really was an amazing program and a significant investment by the organization to say, we acknowledge how distributed we are, and we're going to make a genuine, real effort to bring us to you because that's where you live now. And I have to say, to get that opportunity and to get, the success, the traction that we had with that, and then to see people go like, oh, I know you, or, oh, you live 2 blocks from me and I've never met you before, or, oh, I've never met our CEO. I've worked here for 2 years and now I'm meeting her for the first time because she's coming to Denver, Colorado to hang out with us, or whatever it was, right? And so it was just a great opportunity to do some creative thinking, both about how we think about space, right? Because it's like, oh, all of a sudden, I'm not thinking about real estate as just the portfolio of offices that we maintain and run and operate. Now we're thinking about all of these kind of like in between spaces. And we're also thinking about events as workspace. And so there's really a bunch of different moments or a bunch of different angles to think about when you really dig into that.
One of the things I think makes this job that you're describing is so interesting, but also so hard. And when I say job, I mean as a real estate executive or workplace executive thinking about innovating and evolving in some of these spaces, is policy quite often for the organization sits above workplace, not in terms of importance, but rather just the hierarchy of the kind of like or order in which decisions get made. And so I know a lot of workplace executives just struggle with innovating and coming up with concepts, and then executives will come back and say, actually, we're changing, and now we want people in the office 2 days a week, and it invalidates or shifts a bunch of that decision making. Did you find it stayed consistent over the time that you were innovating here, or did you have to kind of adjust it all to changing perspectives around how people thought about where they wanted work to get done in this new world?
Yeah, I'll speak to PagerDuty, but maybe I'll also speak to my new role a little bit in saying that I think in all organizations, especially publicly traded organizations that are highly influenced by outside events and markets, there's a lot of maneuvering. There's always hey, what's the thing we have to be thinking about today? What's the thing we have to think about this month, this quarter, this fiscal year? And so, of course, there's maneuvering. Of course, there's, hey, would we increase sales if we did X, or would we provide better support to our clients if we did Y? And so I think that there's a lot of that type of maneuvering. And then it's like, okay, how do we come to the fundamental answers that support the culture of the business, but also support the outcomes that we're all driving towards? And so I think one of the places where I was able to provide a bit of strategic maturity was the fact that I understood some core aspects of the business and what the goals were on a cultural kind of like strategy basis. And so knowing some of that and thinking about how you want to grow or what position you want to find yourself in a quarter or a year really did allow for me to maneuver that with some savvy and intelligently, and still get to some of those end results. And look, there were teams that definitely met in person and in the office more than other teams, right? And so it was not a one size fits all solution. And I will tell you, and I'm sure you've heard this, and everyone listening has probably heard this a million times, fully in the office or fully remote are definitely easier than any kind of hybridity or distributed team. It just is. And so, did I complicate that by another layer of working with teams to say, oh, you're going to have team specific rules or norms? Absolutely, we did, right? It becomes even more difficult because you're adding this layer of complexity and management and policy that has to be associated with that. And then you have engineers that go, I'm very talented and make a lot of money and I'm never coming in. Thanks. And you're like, can you
I have
not say that
25 other options if you want to push me really hard on this
exactly
particular
right.
topic.
I'm like, can you not say that in front of the sales team, especially like junior, like BD guys, like biz dev guys? Can you please not say that? And they're like, no, I'm going to say what I want because again, I am in this position.
For
And
the
I'm like,
exact
okay,
same
cool,
reason.
go over there and say that. So does that happen? Sure, it does happen, and you are maneuvering that. But at the same time, I truly believe that if you have a structure that's supporting the outcomes and you're being an outcomes driven organization, not like time stamping, like, oh, did you clock in and out your 40 hours this week? Or no, did you actually get the things done that you're supposed to be getting done as a team? And did you work together and to accomplish this thing that we can do better as a company? Great. That's what we're looking for. So then when I thought about the working with those teams to figure out what their solutions were actually going to be, things like events-based organization planning or events-based meeting structures made a lot of sense. And so I think that I think Atlassian is a great example and has good data that shows us that if you're meeting every 2, 3, 4 months and you're keeping that cycle, you get to results that say, oh, it makes sense to keep our real estate because we have, cascading teams. So this week, these people are meeting. Next week, these people are meeting. The next week, this meeting people are meeting. And then those people will come back in 2 months and you kind of have that flow. And I think that leads to the office space and the workplace becoming much more of an events hosting space. And so then we have to think about the design and build and structure of that. But I really do think that we're all maneuvering that. And then I'll just jump and kind of say yeah, go ahead.
Nathan, I just want to ask you about that because I think it's an interesting point. If I understand correctly, it almost sounds like your evolving view, having experienced this and innovated through it, is that the office or the workplace is a more events driven, more purposeful intention and get together is increasingly the way you see it. Is that right, or is there quite a bit of variability there by team company context? Like where are you starting to come out on this broadly as a topic?
Yeah, so I will tell you, I've been involved with a tech company called Epoch a bit off and on over the years, who's an events-focused company, and I bring them up specifically because they have people in their community talking about this idea a lot. And I'll say there is a certain type of company, often SaaS-based technology companies, who are highly distributed, that this events-based model works really well for. It's kind of sexy to the employees, and it accomplishes a bunch of the goals the executives are trying to accomplish as well. And it kind of says to everybody, hey, this is what hybridity actually looks like, right? It's a little bit of you getting to be heads down at home, but it also includes you coming into the office and working in this way. But it's not I have a mandate where you have to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week. It's a great kind of like a feel-good solution for, I think, that type of business. Now,
The
I've been
Atlassian
pretty
being the poster child of that kind of approach, I guess.
Yeah,
Exactly. Is that
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But I would say that it's interesting because I've become more and more vocal over the last couple of years that this type of distribution or events-based working doesn't work for a whole swath of other types of employees. And I'm not just talking about servers at restaurants or whatever, those kinds of things. I think that when we look at people who manufacture, hardware or devices or actual physical objects, there's all sorts of ways that some of these ideas can start to get laid into other types of work. And so I think that also becomes its own kind of labor movement in a way, because it's like, okay, well, if we can have these types of benefits in one type of market or one type of vertical, what does it take for us to be able to disseminate those ideas into other verticals? And so the reason that really becomes true is because you have businesses like, I'm going to use Ford Automotive as a great example, very physical aspects of the business, very admin aspects of the business. You have also a team of people who are thinking about how to incorporate technology across the company, right? And so a company that in everyone's mind is so associated with this kind of like physical development of a product, has so intelligently and powerfully moved into becoming much more like a technology company and has a bunch of knowledge workers. And so then how do they start to blend those things together? And then I'll just use one more company that I think is really relevant to this, is a company like Caterpillar, who makes tractors and whatever, right? And they're a company that I have heard this kind of like quote coming out of. It's like, hey, these, East and West Coast ideas about what work look like don't work as well. We are in the middle of the country, and if they do, no one's coming here to talk to us about them, developing strategies about them, or whatever. And so it's our company now going out and educating ourselves, learning what it is to do that, and learning how to make our company the best company we can be by picking and kind of like choosing the things that make sense from that type of environment. So I just think that there's a lot of possibilities. And I think that, yes, the events-based solution is great for a certain type of business, but there are going to be other types of businesses that are just kind of like easing their way into some of these work concepts. And like, as we think about the modern organizations or we think about modern work, there's just going to be a beautiful mix, I think, of these things coming together. And it's really going to be what's right for your organization, what's right for your culture, and then what's going to do those things and still allow you to make the amount of money you're trying to make.
So as a workplace executive, it strikes me how complicated this is in the sense that the company strategy around this topic may evolve. And not because the company is unwilling to kind of put a stake in the ground, but may learn things based on how the company is operating and what's working in different areas, and that changes the strategy. Best practice more broadly in the industry may evolve as people learn and understand what other companies are doing. Absolutely. But leases typically are long, and the relative flexibility that workplace execs have or real estate executives have is different than the freedom that maybe you might want to have in customizing all the way down to the team or experimenting with the best practice. And so how, both when you were in that role and now as you think about helping companies think through this, how does a workplace executive thread the needle between sometimes longer, more fixed asset investments, if you will, versus the need to be able to flex and test and play with different ideas in the way that you're describing?
Yeah, it is the hardest question that I can imagine in regards to what's happening. And I think about things like the commercial real estate debt that's going to be outstanding over the next several years as these leases come up, and then also as large loans for building holders come up. There's a huge, I wish I was smart enough to answer some of the things you're asking here. There's a huge number of variables at play in what you're describing. And I'm not trying to avoid certain aspects of that, but what I will tell you is that as a co-founder of PM2, a company that's really focused on representing owners, like that's what we do. Like we understand that the people that we're working with don't have real estate or construction teams in-house. And so we want to help support those people by going out and truly being their representative, by understanding what they're looking to do and how they want to implement those ideas out in the world. And so when you bring this kind of like big question to the table, I'll say, when I'm talking to clients today about how they're thinking about that or how they're challenging that, it is a certain type of customer today that comes to us and says, I want to make a big investment for an opportunity that's going to be 2 years to build and $30 million to build. And it's going to be, 15 or 20 years before I pay it off. It's a very specific type of customer. I would say that, pre-2020, I did a lot of work that was solely commercial office spaces and helping people develop and build out these commercial office spaces. And now in the kind of role where I'm in, it's every place is a workplace, right? And so if every place is a workplace, I have to think really broadly about what types of real estate that I'm talking about. So now am I talking about F&B? Am I talking about retail? Am I talking about public parks? Like I really have to understand what each of these different types of real estate and how people work in those different types of real estate work. And so it is a really complex question. And I would say the people who I see making these big real estate kind of decisions or investments today, both with their dollars, but also with their teams and time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears, right, is really focused on a longer vision. And they're really honed in on the industries or the verticals that they believe that people are going to want to do in person. And so I would just say really high level, that tends not to be office space, and it really tends to be experiential space. So whatever that might mean, could mean a bunch of different things. But what I do think of is, even when we're thinking about those experiential spaces, I always find myself keeping in mind that those experiential spaces, someone works there. Someone's supporting the people who come there and have that experience or enjoying that experience. And so it has to be, every space has to be a mix of both of those things, both the workplace for the people who are supporting the experience and then the people who are going there to enjoy an experience. And so it's funny because now I'm starting to have requests to work on offices again for the first time in a couple of years. And all of a sudden I'm going, oh, right. All of this stuff that I've been doing for the last couple of years, I can create really amazing spaces in offices because people spend so much damn time there. They're there all the time. Like, let's make something that's really great and feels good for them to go so that we magnetize that office space in such a way that people want to go there. It's not like, oh, I have to have this RTO mandate. No, it's like, oh, it's cool for us to get to go there every month or whatever and spend a week together because there's good stuff there for me to do. And there's a way for our team to work together that makes sense. And then there's a really great, whatever, cafe, game room, whatever that thing is. I know it sounds a little cliche, but I mean it. There can be moments in those spaces, and there have to be moments in those spaces when we're designing and building them that feel really like relevant to that team's culture, relevant to that company. And then just like, again, it's a bit of a feel good for people to go and go like, oh, right. It's good and feels great to go work with my teammates and my colleagues. And I'm actually learning and growing with them in that time in real time, in real space.
So give me some prognostications on where we're headed. These
Oh, yeah, I love this.
With Office right now, what is this going to look like 2 years, 3 years from now? Are we going to be talking about the same things? Is it going to evolve? Tell me a little bit about kind of like where the Office conversation, and usage policy, et cetera, you think is going to go.
Yeah, so I think it's going to go all directions simultaneously. It's going to be a little bit like a piece of slime splatting on a table, and it's going to be slowly sprawling out. And I think that means you're going to have really kind of this postmodern, everything is happening pluralism at the same time. And so I think we are going to have certain industries and certain types of workers that you do have back in the office a lot more. I don't think that that's going to be so New York, San Francisco specific. I think that those industries that you see spending so much time in the office in New York, finance, insurance, capital, whatever those things are. Yes, they're going to continue down that path, and that may sprawl a little bit, but I think you're going to see those same types of companies in other parts of the nation do the same thing. So I think we're going to see that. But I also think that we're going to see young, fast-moving startups be in office spaces. And I think that there's some pretty great data that suggests when you're really small, when you're sub 10 or sub 20 people, like being in a room together is just absolutely great and makes you come to decisions so quickly. And everybody knows all of the information that's happening within the business at the same time. And of course, there's this middle ground where you're 500 to 5,000, where those are the hardest space to be for sure. And it gets back to what I was saying about like being all in office versus being remote or whatever. They're kind of in this middling ground, and they have the mix of resources that become the most difficult to manage. I think that those people are going to have to make hard decisions in the next 5 years about which direction they want to go. And I do think that we're going to see a lot of those organizations start to dive in and make those decisions. I've had people even recently say to me, wait, didn't they make those decisions like 2 years ago? And the reality is like a bunch of people made some middling half decisions, some bridges, some band-aids. And I think that now we're at the place where these ideas have started to mature. And I suspect we are going to see a little bit of an inverted bell curve. And we're going to see an increase of people that have to go back to the office a lot more in certain environments and certain types of companies that are seeking certain outcomes. And I think on the opposite end of that, we're going to see a really significant move towards remote work for certain industries and certain types of outcomes. And so the thing that I kind of mentioned to you before about this events-based thing is that, can I picture in my head a WeWork that's just for an events for offices? Absolutely. Like, absolutely. It's like an easy answer. Absolutely. I can imagine that. Can I also imagine a big company saying like, oh, we have that one office that's in, I said Denver before. I'm trying to think of another fun city. Chicago. That's in Chicago. That isn't an office space. There's no heads down space. It's just the place where we all fly to when we're going to do one of these events. Yeah, I absolutely can see a company doing that. Like, it makes a lot of sense for certain types of companies. And so I am concerned about the debt issue that I mentioned before. And I know that that's a very like staunch, hardcore real estate kind of conversation about like, oh, there's all of this landlord debt that's going to come to fruition. But the reality is that creates a great market for companies who want to have a space, because all of a sudden these landlords are so incentivized to make a deal with you, and you're going to be given money to help build a space, and you're going to be given great spaces. Or in this market too, you can reclaim a space that's already built and it's already furnished and it's so beautiful and lovely and just sitting there waiting for you. It's like a puppy at a kennel where you're like, oh, you go there and it's like, please come and use me because I'm so ready to be used. And so I think that there's a lot of great opportunities in the market. And so I just think it's finding the right fit for those companies and trying to figure out which one's right for you. And I think that companies really are going to push hard to make those decisions in the next couple of years.
Awesome. I think it's definitely a big opportunity on the tenant side for sure, I think, for the foreseeable future in that regard. So yeah. Nathan, I appreciate the range of things we've talked about, and there's so much more that we could have gone into. For folks that want to learn more about you or read more about what you're thinking about, where would you send them?
Sure. LinkedIn is easily, I'm there every day, all day, chatting away and really building up the community of people who are thinking about how we think about space, design space, and build space. And then pm2consultants.com is a great way to come and learn more about what owner's representation is and what that looks like and how we might support your team and working through your real estate and construction needs.
Awesome. Nathan, I really appreciate you taking the time. I feel like your experience, both in terms of your own story, in terms of how you got into this world in the first place, which I think is so fascinating, but also the growth that you've seen, the number of offices you've developed, the way you've experimented, and now some of the things you're doing around owner and other aspects of how we think about office are fascinating. So I appreciate you sharing all of your insight and experience and wisdom with us.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and nice to talk with you, Rob.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more FlexIndex content, including past episodes, our FlexIndex newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.